Welcome to today's webinar, A New Approach to Parks and Recreation System Planning, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides current information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides news and information about events, funding opportunities, awards, and resources to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics, available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter for smart growth and planning news and to learn about our upcoming webinars. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speaker in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is a new approach to parks and recreation system planning. You can also search for event number 9214618. I would also like to acknowledge our partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. So to get started, our speaker today is David Barth. Dr. David Barth is a registered landscape architect, certified planner, and certified parks and recreation professional who specializes in the planning, design, and implementation of the public realm. He is also an expert facilitator and strategic planner. David has developed parks and recreation system master plans for more than 100 communities throughout the United States and has led the planning and/or design of hundreds of parks and trails. He was a co-author of the American Planning Association's publication From Recreation to Recreation and contributed to APA's Planning and Urban Design Standards for Parks and Recreation Needs Assessments. Most recently, he authored the PAS report on determining parks and recreation levels of service. David received his undergraduate degree in landscape architecture from the University of Florida, his master's degree from Palm Beach Atlantic University, and his PhD in design, construction, and planning at the University of Florida. Following his presentation, David will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime during the presentation by using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. And as we usually do, we're going to start with a quick poll to find out where everybody is joining us from today. So if you are unable to respond to this, you may need to exit from full screen mode. Those of you who joined us for previous programs have probably been through this before. You have 5 options to choose from, and we'll leave this open briefly for you to respond. And then we'll get started with David. So thank you for those who are responding. I can see that the response is coming in. So we'll leave this open for another 15 seconds or so and close it up and share so you can all see where we are from today. So today's audience, 37% from the Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, 22% from the Midwest, 18% from the South, 14% from the West, and we have an international audience of about 9%. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Barth. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Michael. So thank you all for attending today. Again, the title is A New Approach to Parks and Recreation System Planning. And before I get going, I want to ask a couple more polls. John and Michael are going to take over and ask the first question. I was interested in the makeup of our audience in terms of professionally what your discipline is, and also what kind of agency that you work for.
So you can see the categories up here. We'll give again about 30 to 45 seconds for folks to respond. Now, this is interesting to David and probably for those in the audience as well. Typically, we have about 2/3 to 70% of our audience is planners, broadly defined, self-defined as planners, but it does vary by the topic area. So it'll be interesting to see who's here today. And those who are responding with other, a significant number, you may want to submit something in the questions tab and we'll pass that along to David later on. So our audience today, 54% planners, transportation planners, 13% architects, engineers, landscape architect, 4% researchers and teachers, professors, 2% urban designer, and a quarter of the audience is other.
Interesting. So you stay true to form with your percentage of planners. So the next question was about what kind of agency you work for. So.
Okay, and everybody can see this. I see that folks are already responding. So thank you for participating. So we did get a number of other categories like grants management, parks and recreation director, natural resource manager, public health, libraries, students, more in capital programming, etc. So those are some of the others with us today.
Yeah, that's one of the limitations of our digital medium here, is that we're restricted the number of options.
So 61% are in public agencies, 21% private, 9% non-for-profit, 3% academic, and 5% other.
Interesting. All right, thank you very much. So this is one of my favorite quotes from Peter Harnick, who wrote Urban Green. And he talks about that people say that parks seem relatively simple and straightforward. They say it's not rocket science, it's just a park. And he says, no, you know, for rockets, you just need math. But parks require math and all these other things as well. He says they are immensely complicated. And as someone who has been involved in parks planning for close to 40 years, I have found it's just a wonderful period of time that we're working in. Parks and recreation planning has gotten far more complex than it used to be. It's been a wonderful era as we see things change. I had a Parks and Recreation director client who said, yeah, you know, I used to just ask people what color swing set they want, red or blue. He says, now I'm having to talk about things like storm drainage, and I'm talking about climate change, I'm talking about all kinds of other things as well. So it's a great time to be in the Parks and Recreation system planning business. So in July, Island Press published my book, Parks and Recreation System Planning. And the whole idea was to try to talk about the complexity now of Parks and Recreation planning. And there are two big ideas in the book. So one is that I think we're past the tipping point. People pretty much accept this, that parks and recreation systems can generate all types of sustainability and resiliency benefits if we thoughtfully plan the system and design it and manage it well. But the second part of the book is that we need a more comprehensive and robust process in order to realize those benefits. So this is a table of contents in the book. And I just want to give you a general feel because our presentation today somewhat follows this. But the first part of the book is really talking about broad concepts and philosophy about how we generate benefits from parks and recreation systems. And then the second part is kind of getting ready to do the process. And the third is more of a step-by-step, how do you develop a park system plan? So we go from very, very broad concepts and philosophies to very detailed step-by-step analysis. So in today's presentation, I'm not going to talk about detailed step-by-step as much, but I want to talk about these broad underlying concepts and then talk about some of the takeaways from the new approach that we're proposing in the book. So I'll start with the underlying concepts. For those of you who are really linear, I'll warn you, this is not a linear section of the presentation. This is kind of a bit of a ramble in terms of things that have influenced me in my career, in my writing, and the underlying concepts that have evolved from those influences. And then the second part is going to be a bit more linear. So I'm going to dive right into the meander. The first thing was I joined a multidisciplinary firm called Gladding, Jackson, Kircher, England in 1987, and we were acquired by AECOM around 2010. And as a landscape architect, joining a multidisciplinary firm was eye-opening because all of a sudden I was learning about transportation planning and urban design and environmental planning, private land development, all these different aspects of community. And as you can imagine, we had ongoing debates between, say, the transportation planners who were working on major highways and PD&E studies, and the transportation planners who were focused on urban design and new urbanism. We had ongoing debates between the folks who were involved in private land development and those who were involved in environmental planning and were working to preserve natural systems. So it was a great environment to grow up in. And it led to, I think, one of the underlying concepts that's in the book, this idea, a need to take a multidisciplinary approach to parks and recreation system plans. Oftentimes we have parks and recreation professionals and we have landscape architects or planners, but a lot of the planning processes do not have ecologists or transportation planners or urban designers. And when we talk about the approach in more detail, I'll really underline the need to have a multidisciplinary team in the process. So that's a big influence on my career. Another one is the emergence of sustainability. And I wasn't fully aware of how influential this was for me until I realized that the date of the Brundtland Commission report and the date that I joined Gladding Jackson they were the same era. So 1987 was when the Brundtland Commission report came out. And for those of you who are too young to know this is where the term sustainable communities first really started taking root. And so in our multidisciplinary practice, we really spend a lot of time talking about how do we take these different dimensions of community building, urban design, transportation planning, parks planning, et cetera, and how do we try to move some of the sustainability metrics forward? And there's numerous indicators of success or sustainability metrics out there. This is one set that I like that came from the United Nations. This is from 2012. But we were spending a lot of time trying to understand how different aspects of community planning could lead to advances in each of these indicators or metrics of sustainability. And so that's had a big influence in my career as well. And that's really the heart of the book, which is talking about how do we move some of these different indicators forward through parks and open space system or public realm planning. Somewhere along the way, we started realizing that park systems are often treated as isolated standalone facilities. And that's probably because parks and recreation systems are managed by parks and recreation agencies who aren't always integrated into community planning discussions. And so as part of a multidisciplinary firm, we started understanding how important it was to think about parks and open space as part of an integrated network. So not only did you have other civic spaces, whether it's historical sites or whether it's urban plazas or museum and cultural facilities or schools, you also had these other corridors. So in addition to trails and greenways, which are typically part of a park system plan, we have streets, we have transit, we have utility corridors. So early in our practice, we started understanding the need to illustrate this idea of a what some people refer to as a plexus, an integrated system. And we tried different models, and this is the model that probably stuck the best. We call this our subway map model. That just tries to show graphically this idea of whether you live in a multifamily community or whether you live in a single family community, that Parks and Recreation system is part of an entire integrated public realm. And we have found that that's been really helpful in trying to plan and design for sustainability and resiliency benefits. This is a graphic from Norfolk, Virginia. We worked on their Parks and Recreation open space plan. The map on the left is sort of a typical map that shows the park system, and you can easily see the green areas and where the parks. But the map on the right is a figure ground, and everything in black is publicly owned. And I think it's just a great graphic to try to show, excuse me, the integrated public realm. So if you think about advancing benefits for sustainability and resiliency, and you think about it within the context of the map on the left, you tend to think about isolated sites. But if you look at the map on the right, where about 50% of the community's landmass is in the public realm, you start seeing all kinds of opportunities to advance things, whether it's for transportation or stormwater or water quality or health. All the different aspects of sustainability and resiliency, I think, can be addressed more broadly if you think of Parks and Recreation, again, as part of this integrated public realm as shown on the map on the right. So many of you, I assume, have heard John Crompton speak or read some of his materials, but John Crompton's repositioning of Parks and Recreation was really influential to me and is another underlying concept or an underpinning of the book and the new approach to Parks and Recreation system planning. You know, so early on, he was encouraging Parks and Recreation professionals in particular to not talk so much about programming and park facilities, but to really talk about benefits. And so when he classified the benefits, they look very much like sustainability metrics or sustainability indicators. So he broke the benefits in these same three legs of sustainability, so economic and environmental and social. Now I'll give you just a couple of seconds to look through his list, but it's a very compelling list of the kinds of benefits that can be generated through parks and open space. And again, his intent was to have folks involved in parks and recreation planning who often felt like they were considered a non-essential service to start talking about benefits rather than features and to start being regarded as essential service. And you know, a great example, I think everyone is familiar with the High Line. You can just look at the economic return on the High Line as an example. But John Crompton's work was really influential to me. And this idea of talking about benefits, again, is a major underlying concept of the book and the new approach. The work of the Project for Public Spaces has been very helpful to me and is also an underlying concept, this idea of placemaking and activation. And if you're not familiar with this poster, Project for Public Spaces talks about, you know, every city or region has at least 10 major destinations, and every destination has at least 10 places, and every place has at least 10 things to do. And that gets to the heart of activation in Parks and Recreation system planning. We're working on several Parks and Recreation system master plans for systems around the country, and probably without fail, especially the suburban systems, were planned and designed in maybe the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And oftentimes there's not a whole lot of things to do. And so they're not generating the types of benefits that they would generate if they had more people who were embracing the parks, if they had more activities, more things to do. All kinds of opportunities are being left on the table in order to provide more sustainability and resiliency benefits, whereas if we activated those parks, we can generate greater benefits for the community. So the power of 10 has been a really important underlying concept for Parks and Recreation system planning. I'll show you an example. A couple of years ago, I was asked to go to Hawaii, which is a really tough gig, but it's for a tiny little park in a town called Lihue on Kauai. And this is a downtown park. Lihue is trying to revitalize its downtown. And just as I was speaking about, this park was probably designed in the 1950s and 60s. It had a basketball court, had a playground, had a picnic shelter, and it had a major homeless problem. I don't know if you can see in the back of the photo, but most of the cars around the park have people sleeping in them. And so the park was so underutilized that, the kinds of things that may discourage folks from hanging around all day weren't in place. So it was both a social issue, but it was also the need to activate the park. So the design concept took this little park, and the view from, I'm going to go back a slide on you, the view at the top of the screen from Rice Street looking in is this view here, just to orient you. And so what we propose, consistent with this idea of the power of 10, is multiple things to do around the park, right? So everything from overlaying the court with Hawaiian themes and involving both pickleball as well as basketball and other activities, having in the center of the green, having a sort of a volcanic climbing hill that the kids could climb into, an outrigger splash pad on the left. So we were interpreting the very strong culture and history of the island, and the islanders are very proud of, and then also multiple things to do. So we were trying to work on both placemaking and activation, and these are just some of the images that we developed. So there's the volcanic hill that you can climb, and kids can go down through and come out a tunnel. You can see people all around the park can just hang out and watch kids. They can there's Wi-Fi, there's things to do. You can bring a picnic if you're working in the area. It's a great place to hang out for lunch. This is the playground, more seating. You can see the fountain in the distance. And then here we have the outrigger splash fountain in the center of the photo. So this idea of activation and placemaking can even be applied to a small park like Kalina Park, which is less than an acre in size. So another underlying concept is a 10-minute walk initiative, which I'm assuming almost everyone on the call is familiar with. It's been interesting to apply this to suburban and rural communities, right? Because in urban communities where we have the street grid, people pretty readily accept the idea that every resident should live within a 10-minute walk of a park. But in suburban communities, it's much more difficult, so it becomes aspirational. So for years, we have talked about a service area level of service, or an access level of service, as one of the level of service metrics. And it was difficult sometimes to get people to understand the importance of walkability or bikeability. And the 10-minute walk initiative has really helped that become clear to folks. So that has caught on, and I think is part of the lexicon for almost every park system planning project in the United States. And we find out from our needs assessments, by the way, that almost every park system plan, walkability, bikeways and trails are a top priority need in almost every community that we work in. I don't know if you've seen this, but Galen Kranz wrote this book, Politics of Park Design, in 1982, and it's been very influential for me. She was trying to understand through literature reviews and coding of different literature research how parks have responded to the needs of communities in the United States over the last 150 to 200 years. And what she found through her research is that we have gone through these eras, they each last about 30 to 50 years, where we have responded to community needs in different ways. So she documented what she called the pleasure ground, and then the reform park and recreation facility and open space system, each of which responded to community needs in a different way. And then in 2004, she came out with an article, and she said, you know what, we have just entered into a new era around 1990, 1995, which she called the sustainable park. And that's had a big influence on our practice, and it's had a big influence on the concepts in the book, because she says the sustainable park focuses on making cities more ecologically and socially balanced and sustainable, but they also play a role in solving urban problems outside of the boundaries of the park. And that's very consistent with the concept that we had developed that talked about this integrated public realm, right? The idea that if you looked beyond the boundaries, the property boundaries of any particular open space, and you started seeing it within the framework or the context of a larger system, that you had so many more opportunities to address larger problems that a community is facing. So many times now in our park system planning process, not only do we ask folks what their needs are for parks and open space, we also ask them what are some of the community-wide issues that they're facing, and that's part of the new approach as well, so that we're not only building up a needs assessment regarding recreation needs, but we're developing needs assessments based on community-wide issues. Green infrastructure has kind of gained acceptance into planning vocabulary. I'm going to say the last 10 to 15 years. Some folks may say it's been longer than that. You know, a great example of green infrastructure is the historic Fourth Ward Park in Atlanta, which has been a beautifully designed park that has been a catalyst for redevelopment of the surrounding community. I don't know if you know the story, but the original plans were to help retain and treat stormwater, but also to help mitigate for downstream flooding by building underground storage tanks in a brownfield industrial development area. And so instead, and I don't know the person responsible for this brilliant idea, but instead they found they could save money by actually developing a park that was designed to treat stormwater and mitigate flooding. So not only could they save money, they could generate all kinds of economic, social, and environmental benefits for the community. So this is what the historic Fourth Ward Park may look like on a normal day. This is what it looks like when it floods, and then it returns back 3 days later or so back to being a beautiful park. But this whole idea of green infrastructure is really integrated into the ideas that we're talking about in the new approach. That again, we're not just talking about traditional parks and recreation. We're talking about how do we address sea level rise, and how do we address flooding and stormwater treatment and water quality and social issues? How do we create great gathering spaces? How do we, as we talked about with historic Fourth Ward, how do we improve the taxable values of adjacent property? So green infrastructure has been an important part of that as well. Along maybe 2010, 2012, I think resiliency came to the forefront. Again, it may be longer than that, but it's when I started taking notice of it. Maybe I was slow to the party. But I really like the Rockefeller Foundation's framework, and I got this from David Rouse, you know, of talking about that you can think about resiliency in terms of shocks and chronic stresses. I always found that sustainability was difficult to get your arms around, and that's why there's so many different sustainability metrics or indicators. But I think the same thing with resiliency. It really helps to break it down, and it becomes very simple to me when we talk about resiliency shocks on one hand and chronic stresses on the other. So I have found that that makes it a little more, it makes it easier to talk about community benefits through parks and recreation when you can talk about how you are affecting either of these two columns, right? You can talk about specific things that you're doing towards drought or towards flooding or towards wildfire. And again, it becomes more tangible. A couple of more influences, and I'll be done with this part of the process. There are a couple of projects in my career that have been really fulfilling and influential for me. One was around 2007, we had an opportunity to kind of try out all these ideas through the MiamiDade County Parks and Recreation Open Space Master Plan. And you can see from the title, we had a client in MiamiDade who was willing to talk about the specific role of parks and open space towards unification, towards livability, towards sustainability through 5 areas of the public realm: parks, public spaces, natural and cultural places, streets and greenways, trails and water trails. And the client also embraced these principles of sustainability. So equity and access, beauty, multiple benefits, seamlessness, and then environmental sustainability. And so I've always loved this poster because on one hand, it really reflected the kind of work that we did, but also I thought was a compelling graphic, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but compelling graphic that really expressed this idea that through parks and open space, we could really generate benefits that would change the culture of the county. Now, since that time, the county has implemented a lot of the ideas from the master plan and several new ones. You may have heard of the Underline, which is another James Corner project, same designer as the Highline. Coincidentally, and I think this is a bit humorous, this is under the Metro Rail project, and it replaces the plain, straightforward, sterile pathway that was under the Metro Rail that was designed to be a bike path and was also designed to service the overhead rail. So coincidentally, the person who designed that sterile, boring bike path in their first job out of school was me. So it's been interesting to see the progression from kind of a single dimensional idea, and this would have been back in the 80s, to now here we are talking about the underline as a major urban space that can generate multiple benefits for the community. So it kind of reflects, again, the progression of my career, as well as the progression of thinking in the planning and design of public spaces. The other thing that, another major initiative that came out of the plan was MiamiDade has really taken the forefront in developing youth programs that address childhood obesity, that address child fitness, really getting into underserved communities, and really focusing on host, excuse me. And so they made great strides in helping kids make great progress. And part of what they've done is they established metrics early in the process. So it's not just offering the programs, it's they've been able to measure the success of those programs in creating healthier families and healthier youth in the community. So that's been a big influence on me. Another project that's highly influential was in the mid-2000s, we master planned Kissimmee's lakefront property. And Kissimmee is a community of about 60,000 people, so it's not a large community by far. But they were renovating this 1950s era lakefront park to what you see now on the upper photo and the lower photo on the right. And in the first year alone, they increased visitation to downtown, and a big reason for them doing this was they wanted to revitalize their downtown, which is about 2 or 3 blocks to the right. It's become the true epicenter of social interaction in the city. It's improved the water quality of the lake. Property taxes have gone up. Jobs have increased. The park is booked now over a year in advance with public events and private events. And they've attracted all kinds of new investment, both public investment as well as private investment into the area surrounding the park. I love the quote from the mayor on the day that we broke ground. The mayor said, people are asking why the city of Kissimmee is spending $30 million in the middle of a recession on a park. And he says, the reason we're spending $30 million on a park in the middle of the recession is because we're in the middle of a recession. And he totally understood the relationship between investing in Kissimmee's signature park and the need to revitalize the community. So I always thought that he had tremendous courage and had tremendous foresight in making that investment at a time when a lot of people said they couldn't afford it. And it has generated benefits beyond anyone's wildest imagination that have really created a great return on investment. And then around 2012, I went back to school at a ripe old age to get my doctorate. And I had come off of that Kissimmee experience. And for those of you who have not been involved in a doctoral research program, you have to develop a research topic. And my topic was the adoption of innovation in the design of public open spaces. And I was trying to understand what were the factors that led to the adoption of innovation. Because we had such an incredible experience in Kissimmee, but I had other projects that did not generate the kind of benefits that Kissimmee generated. And so in order for me to go study case studies to determine what were the factors that led to the adoption of innovation, I had to define what do you call the kind of case study that generates the kind of benefits that Kissimmee generated. So we call that a high performance public space, and you can see the definition there. Well, in order to identify those high performance spaces so I could study them in order to determine the factors that led to the adoption of innovation, we had to come up with criteria. And so we developed what's called a Delphi committee, where we had 22 sustainability experts. And we developed these 25 criteria, and they're in the 3 legs of sustainability. And the idea was that a high performance public space must meet 80% or at least 20 of those 25 criteria, because a high performance public space had to touch all 3 legs of sustainability. And so I'll give you a second to look at these lists. But suffice it to say, this has become a major underlying concept for the new approach to parks and recreation system planning as we practice it. because again, it helps us to realize these are the kinds of things that we are trying to, these are the kinds of benefits that we're trying to generate for the community. And so breaking them down into criteria, just like we talk about sustainability indicators or resiliency indicators, really helps us focus on what are those things that we're trying to generate for our community through the Parks and Recreation System master planning process. Last slide, there's a couple of other best practices from other disciplines that have influenced me in my practice and influenced our approach. There's a lot of research from project management studies that's been helpful. Strategic planning has been helpful. This chart on the right talks about the difference between a strategic plan and a traditional plan. And I've always thought that Parks and Recreation System plannings are strategic plans, but I hadn't seen this clearly, the difference between the two. And so very much, I believe that Parks and Recreation System plans need to be result-oriented all the way down the list to the emphasis on implementation. So I think this idea of strategic plans really influence Parks and Recreation System planning process is important. And then one of the benefits of going back to school, as many of you have probably experienced, is you learn more about research. And I knew nothing about research before I went into the PhD program. But what I realized was Parks and Recreation needs assessments are actually a form of applied social research projects. And so that's helped me in terms of developing this new approach that bolsters, I think, for lack of a better word, the robustness of our needs assessment work through applying some of the principles from research. So I appreciate everybody sitting through that non-linear process, but those are some of the thoughts, some of the influences in my career and some of the underlying concepts of this new approach. And now I'm going to get a bit more linear on you and talk about the approach that we're proposing that incorporates a lot of those concepts and also some of the keys to success. So before I do that, I had a couple more polls.
Okay, so it's been launched here. Next question is, have you been involved in a city, county, or regional parks and recreation systems needs assessment or planning process before? A very simple yes or no. And again, if you need to exit from full screen mode to respond, please do. We'll give you another 15 seconds or so to respond. A number of people are. It's interesting to see where this is coming in. For those who this question is relevant. Then I'll be shutting it momentarily. So for this particular audience today, it's a 60-40 split to yes.
That's interesting. Okay, great. All right, so the next one was asking if you've been involved in one of these. I'm curious as to what, I call them dimensions, you may call them perspectives, what dimensions you have been able to address in your park system plan for those 60% of you who have been involved in them.
Okay, and we'll again leave this open for a while for folks to respond.
This one's particularly interesting to me because when I did a research of park system plans around the United States, and I was looking for where they were multidisciplinary, I found that most of us who practice doing park system plans really are pretty single dimensioned in our work. We try being multidimensioned, but I was looking for communities that co-planned park systems, transportation systems, stormwater systems, and I found very few who did concurrent planning of those major systems. So I was just curious. We have such a great audience that I wanted to see what other people's experience was.
Okay, and we'll show this here. So 49% greenways, blueways, and trails, 29% streets, sidewalks, bikeways, and public transit, 10% historical cultural sites, public art, 9% stormwater, and 3% schools and libraries.
Great, that is really consistent with my practice. And I think that's where we have a lot of room for improvement, and that's where we can, I believe, affect the greatest change in terms of community sustainability and resiliency. It's by adding those different dimensions to our system planning processes and trying to integrate them with other elements of the public realm. So I'm going to talk about the approach. The diagram on the left shows, I think, how most of the 60% of us on the call have traditionally practiced Parks and Recreation system planning. It's very much a strategic planning process, beginning with the existing conditions and then going into needs assessment, long-range vision, implementation, and approval and adoption. I think it's worked well for a lot of years. I believe it can be improved upon in order to generate the kind of benefits that we're talking about. So this is the diagram that's in the book, and hopefully your screen is large enough to see this. This is a diagram that's in the book that talks about this proposed new approach. Now I'm going to take a couple of minutes to talk about this before we move on, and then I'll get into what I think the keys are to success in each of these areas. So it's shown as a circular process as opposed to linear for a couple of reasons. One is that more and more, I think historically, we've done parks and recreation system plans about every 10 years in a lot of communities, and sometimes we're lucky if it's even that often. And because demographics are changing so quickly and trends are changing so quickly, I think it's more of a cyclical thing, but by the time you start implementing phase one improvements, it's really time to start the process all over again. So I've been encouraging our clients to at least do needs assessments every 5 years to affirm that the recommendations that come out of a master plan are still valid, and ideally update the entire master planning process every 5 years. The other reason I think it's cyclic is that we have found more and more, the more complex you get in what you are trying to address, the more you tend to go around the loop a couple of times before you ever finish the master planning process. That it's not as linear. If you're willing, for example, to go down what I'll call the rabbit hole of community health, you may find in the existing conditions phase, you find out all kinds of things about community health, but you may also find out more things when you get into the visioning phase, which means you may want to go back to the existing conditions phase and retool or reassess some of the things that you've come up with. So it's not necessarily a linear process as we're proposing it, in that you may go around, again, around and around a couple of times before you're finished. So let me take you through the differences I think there are between the circular process and the linear process. The first one, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm pointing at number one. The first one is spending more time in the initiation and planning phase. Oftentimes, public agencies will take a standard Parks and Recreation system planning scope, and they'll say, let's go do this, and we dive right in. My friend Terry Clark, who's written a book called Project Management for Planners several years ago, talks about that if done well, the initiation and planning phase of a project can take as much as 40% of the project manager's time in just getting ready to do the plan. And I think that's really applicable to comprehensive Parks and Recreation system plans if you wish to address the different dimensions of sustainability and resiliency and livability. So a big change, I believe, or maybe in addition to the traditional planning process, is the emphasis on spending more time getting ready, developing a project charter, developing a project plan, making sure you have the right team in place. So for example, if you want to address community health issues, the project team probably needs to include somebody who's involved in community health. You may need a transportation planner if you want to really talk about complete streets as part of a trails and bikeways network. You may need a stormwater engineer if you want to talk about stormwater and flooding. So again, taking the time to get the team together, making sure you have the adequate budget, making sure that you're ready to do this, all these things are important. So that's one enhancement of the traditional process. Another one is when you get down to item number 3, that the traditional process says I'm going to go evaluate the park system that's in place. So typically we have evaluation criteria. We go visit all the park sites. We do inventory and analysis. We develop base maps. But if you're doing an evaluation of existing conditions where you have multiple dimensions of sustainability and resiliency, then that evaluation process gets far more robust and far more comprehensive. And I don't know if any of you have seen the Nightline episode. This is going back 20 years or so. You may want to look it up on YouTube, but they did what they call the deep dive, and they were evaluating the planning and design process. They were trying to explain how design works for the general public. And so they did a great episode called the deep dive with the industrial design firm IDEO. And they talked about how you send people out to go investigate different aspects of what you're thinking about. So this idea of going and investigating stormwater and community health and youth obesity and climate change, whatever those aspects are that you want to study as part of your system plan, take a lot of time and effort. And so again, the difference between maybe the traditional process and the new approach says we spend a lot more time in the evaluation process than we may have ordinarily. A big difference between the traditional process and the new approach is item number 4. And we call it a preliminary implementation framework. You may have a different term for it. But what we have found in a lot of our planning processes is we may know enough from existing data, and we may not know enough to be dangerous, but we know enough that we can develop a hypothetical vision and a hypothetical cost estimate, which allows us to start having discussions about implementation early in the process. And the benefit to that has become that we are talking about funding, we're talking about implementation, we're talking about comp plans, we're talking about codes, we're talking about impact fees, talking about all the different aspects of implementation early in the process as opposed to waiting to the end where people are really eager to get done, eager to get adoption. And I'll talk about that in more detail, but that's been a fundamental change to our process that's different than maybe the traditional approach. I talked a little bit, and I'll talk in more detail later about item number 6, the need for a more robust and scientific needs assessment process that uses mixed methods and uses an applied social science research. So that's been a change in our practice. Level of service metrics need to expand way beyond the traditional parks and recreation level of service metrics, and I'll talk about that a bit more detail. That if you're going to address elements of sustainability and resiliency, then you need metrics that relate to sustainability and resiliency in addition to the traditional parks and recreation metrics. And then I think the rest is pretty typical for almost everyone on the call does summary reports, although we have emphasized the importance of briefings now in our practice, that we want to touch the decision makers 4, 5, 6, 7 times, as opposed to the traditional, maybe there's one public workshop and then another workshop for adoption. So really getting, building consensus all throughout the process, which are those areas shown in white, as opposed to just at the end. Coming back around full circle, having an implementation strategy that builds on the preliminary implementation framework after we developed a long-range vision. And by the way, our visioning process really breaks into separate workshops for each of the top priority needs that we've come up with for the needs assessment approach. So if we have a top priority need to address stormwater, for example, then we will have a visioning workshop on what's the appropriate response to that need, and that leads us into our long-range vision. And then you go all the way around the circle, you have briefings, you have presentations, and you have adoption, and ultimately, the hope of any good plan, which goes back to that strategic planning approach, is that we're ready to implement. And our goal is to actually start implementation before we ever complete the planning process. So that's an overview of the new approach or the enhanced approach. And I want to talk about some key factors for success. And then we'll take questions after that. So first factor, I mentioned to you in my research at the University of Florida I was looking for the factors that lead to the adoption of innovation in the planning and design of public spaces. And so this was the finding. There were 3 primary factors that lead to the adoption of innovation. And they are the presence of a strong leader, right, for the innovative ideas. It's a collaborative relationship of the planning and design team, and it's the external characteristics, meaning how open were you to the public, how transparent were you, how involved were stakeholders in the process. What was interesting to me in my research was, based on my experience, I thought that some of this happened organically, like the strong leader, was just obviously was going to be the mayor or was going to be a community activist, and that the collaborative relationship of the planning and design team would be because people generally liked each other, they liked working together, etc. One of the surprises I found was that there are 2 types of leaders. First of all, you have the charismatic leader, who's oftentimes an elected official, but you also have the leader who is the project manager, who's the one who really pulls things together. It's the combination of those 2 leaders. And then I found that in all of my case studies, that the collaborative relationship did not happen just because people liked each other. It was because the strong leader mandated that the team work well together. And so that was interesting in my case studies to see how what the influence was of the strong leader in making sure that these other factors were in place. We now use this as kind of a checklist in our planning processes. So before we ever start, and this gets back to that idea of spending time at the planning phase, we ask the question, is there a strong leader who's going to help implement the findings that we come up with? Or is this going to be a plan that sits on the shelf because no one's going to be an advocate for the implementation of the innovations that come out of the planning process? We also ask whether there is a collaborative team in place and whether it has the different disciplines that are needed to really address these broader issues, and whether a community is willing to be as open and transparent as they need to be in order to have a successful project. So it's changed from the findings of my research to actually being a bit of a self-auditing checklist before you get involved in the process, if you really want to see your process leading to transformative changes that relate to sustainability and resiliency. Now there's secondary and tertiary factors as well that you can look at on this list, but those 3 primary factors were the ones that were most influential in the adoption of innovation. This is a project I'll talk about in a little bit more detail, but I love it as a case in point. This is a green space plan that followed a fairly traditional system planning process, although we did a hypothetical vision. This is outside of Buckhead. This is in Atlanta. I'm sorry, this is the Buckhead plan outside of Atlanta. We did a hypothetical framework. We did a hypothetical vision. And the number one need that came out of this project was for what's called the Path 400 trail on State Road 400. And the photo on the right was a groundbreaking ceremony. And the people in the photo on the left, I don't know if you can see my cursor, is Carlos Perez, who is a colleague of mine and was the project manager. But here, holding the ribbon, is Denise Starling, who is the executive director of Livable Buckhead, and then holding the scissors is Howard Shook, who's the city commissioner. So that was a great example of the importance of strong leadership that led to the adoption of innovation of this project. And again, I'll talk to you about that in more detail. Second key factor for success is what I call intentionality. So I've talked about multiple dimensions of a park system plan. This is what I think of as a short list of just 50 dimensions that I put together in about a half an hour. But we talked about how complex parks and recreation system planning can be. And so I think it's really important that if you're going to lead a parks and recreation system planning process with the intention of generating community-wide benefits for sustainability and resiliency, that you decide up front which of these dimensions do you want to address, because you certainly don't have time or resources to address all of them. But you do have time and resources typically to address a half a dozen or so of those. And so this idea of identifying multiple dimensions early in the process and being very intentional about them and spending time, as I talked about, in the planning phase, in the existing conditions phase, and ultimately in the implementation metrics phase is really important. So this idea of intentionality is a key to success. The third one is what I've talked about a couple of times now, this idea of having a hypothetical vision and a preliminary implementation framework. One of my favorites is one that has just been developed recently. We're working in a small town that only has 17,000 people in it, a town of Groveland, but has this incredibly progressive planning department. And they have developed their future land use vision. This is if you can see my cursor, the lower part of the screen where that red asterisk is, as you can see the town grid. This is the existing town, but they are experiencing suburban sprawl, and they're working to annex everything else that you see to the north of that red asterisk, about 50 square miles of area that are going to become ultimately the city boundaries of a community of about 50,000 people. And the darker tan and red colors are where they are proposing to have higher density development, and they are proposing to preserve about 50% open space in the entire city. What they have not developed was a real graphic vision of what that might look like. So we took all of the documents that had already been developed, trails concepts, open space preservation concepts, land use concepts, and developed this hypothetical vision within the first couple of months of starting the process. And we've been using it to go ahead and start having discussions about everything you see on the right. So by developing this hypothetical vision, and it may not hold true, one of the things we have to be careful for is not being married to that vision and being open to making changes as we complete the needs assessment and other aspects of the plan. But it's allowing us to have all these conversations about comp plan changes, code changes, design changes. You can just go all the way down the list, impact fees, stormwater. It's been a really helpful exercise. So, you know, that's another key to success, I believe, is doing this hypothetical vision. And it can be as conceptual as you need it to be, but to start having these conversations about implementation early on, as opposed to waiting to the end. I talked a lot about, you know, what I learned from learning about research. And so this is a general outline of our needs assessment process. And so it simply means that we're trying to be more scientific. We're trying to be researchers as opposed to planners. And so we try to take off our planning hat, get away from the bias that maybe we showed in our hypothetical vision, and be pure researchers free of bias when we're using different needs assessment techniques. And so we emphasize the importance of a statistically valid tool, you know, which is the mail survey that's based on a random sample. And I think all of you know that, you know, that's the only technique that we have that's based on a random sample of a community. It's the only statistically representative tool that we have. And so it's really important that in our toolkit, we have statistically valid techniques as well as more qualitative techniques. So we oftentimes start with the qualitative techniques, interviews, focus groups, public workshops. Because of the pandemic, as many of you have experienced, our toolbox has expanded, and we have a lot of great techniques now to engage the public. But then we're able to use the findings from those qualitative techniques for these more quantitative techniques, everything from benchmarking and level of service analysis to the mail survey and online survey. So it's that combination of those techniques, the idea of mixed methods, as opposed to just one or two. You know, we have 8 or 10 different techniques, and then triangulating, comparing the findings from all those techniques. So where we come up with a credible needs assessment finding where we can report back to the elected officials that we think we have a set of valid findings that address what the top priorities of the community are, which I think, as many of you know, those top priorities are what lead to the implementation strategy and the allocation of resources. You know, so I talked about new tools in the toolkit. So this is an example of my colleague Carlos, you know, conducting a Zoom meeting, and we have found that these have been incredibly helpful for interviews, for small focus group meetings. They don't work quite as well for large gatherings like we have today, but through polling, we can get some pretty good data. But because we're also opening back up and being able to go back into in person, you know, we're still holding on to some of the kind of in-person techniques that we used to use in the past. So this was a workshop just a week ago for a small community meeting where we did a walking tour. and we're focused on, we're developing a public realm plan for this historically Black community. The community is actually on the National Register of Historical Places. It's called American Beach, and it was a historic Black beach during segregation. And so in our public realm plan, we're looking at how do we address storm drainage, how do we address preservation of culture and history of the community through public art, how do you address ecological aspects. This is actually, you're looking at one of the highest sand dunes in Florida, and so there's ecological significance to the sand dune. And so part of the technique that we're using is just walking around the community with the community stakeholders and talking about the significance of all these aspects of the public realm. And how do we blend those into the community? So again, this idea of mixed methods, because we're also going to do a statistically valid survey to reach the larger community. In this case, we'll be able to afford to go to survey every single homeowner and resident of the community. So it won't be just a random sample. Every resident will have an opportunity to participate. So another key factor for success are indicators. And so we talked about the importance of not just having traditional indicators such as acreage and access and facilities, but also bringing in sustainability metrics. So the sketch on the left is of Washington, D.C., looking at the quality of facilities, but you can see some of the different dimensions here on the two columns. So if you're interested in bicycle pedestrian access, here are some of the indicators or metrics you can use to measure that. You know, if you're interested in metrics for health and wellness or green infrastructure, social educational programs, economic development, these are all different metrics that you can use to measure those. The importance of the metrics are that when you're starting out in the process, it's really important to get clear on what you're trying to achieve. And so sustainability and resiliency metrics help you develop indicators of desired future conditions. And so that helps you hone in what is it we're really trying to affect. And if you can develop a metric for it using data that's readily available, and I can't emphasize enough that metrics must be based on data that's easy to collect, because no one, especially those of you in public agencies, can afford to have 10 different staff who do nothing but collect data for metrics. So it's got to be based on data that you can easily collect. But I think that's a key indicator for success as well, or a key factor for success. I talked about, this is the sixth one, I talked about the need for compelling vision and graphics. And again, I just showed two graphics, both the MiamiDade one and the Washington, D.C. one, both of which are just kind of some of my favorites. But all of you are familiar with the different kind of computer graphics that people can create now. I showed you Kalina Park in Kauai. This is one of the graphics that Carlos, again, my colleague in Atlanta, created for a trail corridor that has potential to be a high performance public space. So it's taking an alleyway that can also be a trail corridor, that can also be a linear park in the Atlanta area. And you know, just like the Beltline is a major high performance public space, even this small alleyway has the potential to be that as well. So we're showing fitness equipment, we're showing community gardens, it's used as a bicycle pedestrian corridor, there's public art, all kinds of opportunities in just this small corridor to do that. So there's nothing like graphics that make this accessible. You know, before we had computer imaging, we were dependent on master plans. A lot of people couldn't read. A lot of people can't read or interpret just flat maps, or we had hand-drawn sketches. And you know, computer imaging, photo imaging is so much more effective in getting buy-in towards innovations. It's just been a wonderful advancement in the last 20 years or so, particularly the last 10 years. The last key to success, I talked about the Buckhead project. I talked about the leadership we had. These are some of Carlos's slides as well, talking about, in this case, focus on implementation. From the very beginning of the Buckhead project, we got the steering committee to talk about how they were going to implement. And again, the catalyst for the green space project in Buckhead was an economic catalyst. So from the very beginning, we were talking about the economic dimension. Also, it was a water quality issue, it was a traffic congestion issue. So it was, in this case, it was the developers and the property owners who funded this project because they were losing market share to Midtown. So we had a green space plan, a public realm plan that was really being funded by the private development community. So from the very beginning, we were talking about how do we implement this. And so we developed the overall plan. We identified the top priority corridor, which was, again, the Georgia 400 or the Path 400 trail along Georgia 400. And so before the public space plan or the green space plan was ever completed, we were already developing concepts and moving forward into implementation of the #1 priority, which really was this transportation or alternative transportation corridor along Georgia 400. So we talk about some of the images, some of the things that we can do with digital photography. So this is behind the sound barrier. This is actually in the backyards of some residents. And we talked about what that probably could look like. That was a tough issue. We went homeowner to homeowner whenever anybody wanted to talk to us and talked about what it might look like in their backyard. And there's a lot of concern, as you can imagine. And so this is an image of on the other side of some of the barrier walls, looking down on the corridor itself. And this is a project, quite frankly, that I had my doubts about. I never thought this could be implemented because there must have been at least 5 different agencies, from Georgia DOT to property owners to different agencies in the Atlanta area. And this is the image of what it might look like at grade when it really touched down in downtown Buckhead. But I'm pleased to say, the project was implemented. The first corridor has been implemented. It's being highly used. So again, from the very beginning, we talked about implementation of the green space plan and what that might look like, and building the constituency and the consensus about moving forward as we develop the green space plan. So I go back to that's a major focus of success, and it gets us back to Howard and Denise and Carlos celebrating, on opening day, this great project. So that clearly is probably one of the greatest factors for success. So to wrap it up, thank you very much for spending time listening. Some key points, I think, are I don't think we have to do the heavy lifting anymore. For those of you who are in parks and recreation agencies, you've struggled for a long time about being considered as a non-essential service. And I think there's pretty wide acceptance, which has really been furthered by this epidemic we've had of people seeing parks and trails and open spaces critical to their well-being. So there's pretty much an irrefutable relationship that's been established between great park systems and resilient and sustainable and livable communities. We don't have to battle that anymore. I've talked about several times how important I think intentionality is, right? This idea of intentionally planning your park systems as part of the public realm and intentionally broadening your perspectives to include other dimensions of sustainability and resiliency. I haven't mentioned this much, but I think it's been a side benefit for a lot of agencies. Those who have stepped up and have developed park system plans as tools for sustainability and resiliency, and have followed John Crompton's advice about talking about benefits, talking about economic development, talking about social issues, talking about water quality, talking about the things that their elected officials really care about, have attracted far more resources, both in terms of responsibility, in terms of visibility of the department, in terms of greater resources to do what they want to do than others. So I think the planning process alone, if it's broad and robust and comprehensive, can really elevate departments who take the leadership in the community, and it generates great kinds of benefits for that department and those leaders alone. And then finally, we talk about the planning process, which is really a topic for today, that this more comprehensive, rigorous, robust process, when you apply all these principles and practices from other disciplines, can really generate all kinds of benefits for your community. So again, I thank you very much for taking the time to join us today, and I'll send it back to Michael and to John to take any questions.
Great, thanks, David. And thanks everybody who submitted questions here. We're gonna go to at least 2:30 Eastern, maybe a couple of minutes beyond that, just because of the volume of questions. And I'll say it's quite significant here, David. So I'll just get started and we'll go through to get to as many as we can. We probably have 40 or 50, which we'll never be able to get to all of them, but we'll share, I think, some of the relevant ones. I guess we'll get started here to say, and this is a question that came in near the end when you were kind of summing up. When you do the integrated process like this, how do you handle the large priority changes that come with changing administrations? Each big change in priority would ripple through the entire set of plans or remain unaddressed, and unaddressed consequences would add to the risk for the community and failure overall. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that in order to get these plans to take hold, they have to find a home. If they exist only on the shelf of the planning department, but they're not in the comprehensive plan, or they're not in your land development codes, then they cease to exist for a lot of folks. So I showed that laundry list of implementation tools for the city of Groveland. Getting the vision into your comp plan, getting the key elements in your comp plan, the metrics, the needs assessment findings, I think you can pluck a lot of the key aspects of this plan and give it a home in the comp plan. In my perfect world, every elected official would have a poster on their wall. And so we've tried that as well, so that you try to make the plan live through those graphics like I showed you for MiamiDade, where even a new administration, when they move in, is exposed to the concepts through executive summary brochures, through posters, but also, again, I'm back to probably more importantly, they're exposed to it because it's policy in your comp plan and your codes.
Okay, thanks, David. The next question here is from our colleague in Baltimore County, Wallace Lippincott, who's talking about metrics and indicators. You discussed the use of metrics, but that they have limitations. I think this is true with land preservation, particularly for ag preservation. The attention has been on acreage, but the basis for the acreage is somewhat arbitrary. Do you have suggestions on how to develop meaningful indicators for land preservation goals?
Yes, actually, if I can remember, if this person will email me, you can see my, it's david@barthassociates.com. I'll send you the source of this, but the national parks, national forests, and other national agencies have put together a visitor guide, and they talk about how to do management planning for conservation lands and preservation lands. And they have developed, I think, a wonderful process that we've been trying to incorporate into our parks planning process, which is they start with desired future conditions. And so they try to describe, in terms of land preservation, what is it you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve preservation for certain species? Are you trying to achieve preservation for water quality? What are all the desired future conditions that you're trying to affect? And then based on the desired future conditions, they come up with the idea of indicators of success. And those indicators of success are nothing more than metrics. So if you use an indicator, let's say I'll use Florida as an example. My preservation goal is because I want to preserve Florida panther, and I need huge amounts of habitat. What's my indicator of success? My indicator of success is I actually need to see an increase in the number of panthers that are surveyed every year, or Florida's the number of manatees. And so now I have a very meaningful metric in terms of how well am I doing. And then taking those indicators of success and those metrics, and you can apply this to anything that anybody on the call wants to develop metrics for. You can turn those metrics into an annual report and start tracking how well you're doing year to year in advancing towards those desired future conditions. So I think I'm hoping I'm answering the question, but I can send you this report developed by the National Park Service. And I think following their methodology really helps you develop metrics that are meaningful.
Okay, thanks, David. Next question also has to do with how to kind of implement this. Do you have any recommendations for writing a solid RFP for a plan to ensure that consultants that will use the new approach We have shied away from hiring consultants because we did not want a traditional or linear planning process, resulting in a cut and paste plan from a previous
Right.
fee.
Right. No, it's I'm laughing because I definitely have a bias here, so I'll share you my bias. I think, first of all, that your RFP should say what it is you want to achieve. And I encourage my clients not to develop a scope. You can certainly say that here's what we want to achieve. We're trying to be innovative in these areas, and we want to make sure we've included a needs assessment. We want to make sure we've got a long-range vision. These are things that are important to us, but we want to hire people based on qualifications. And we will work together, then we'll collaborate on developing a scope that meets our needs, as opposed to us writing a scope, meaning us, the public agency, writing a scope. Because as for those of us on the call who are on the consulting side, we may have all kinds of ideas to share with you, but oftentimes your RFPs don't allow us to be creative. All we can say is, well, we think you should add this, or we think we should add this. So most of the folks in the consulting side really enjoy participating as a collaborator with you in developing a scope. The other difficulty you have is if you do an RFP where you're asking folks to compete based on fee, it kind of stymies some creativity, because all of a sudden you're asking them to be low bidder and be creative. Where what I would prefer that public agencies do is say, here's what we want to achieve, here's the budget we have available, and we'd like you to submit an approach that allows us to achieve what we want to achieve within our budget. And I would guess that most of the consulting firms on the call would agree with me that they'd much rather participate that way. Tell you, here's how they would approach it, here's what the budget would be based on their approach, with a menu of items. Maybe it's that, they will, here's our baseline, and if you wish to add this, this will cost this amount of money, but an a la carte menu. So thank you for that question, but those are some of my thoughts. Those are some of my biases about the selection process.
Thanks, David. Actually, we got a similar question, kind of following up what you just said, well, from Susan Madison, who's asking, how much of a larger planning budget would a client require for a circular planning process that you're recommending?
Yeah, that's a tough one to add. For those of you who aren't familiar, the range of fees for these planning processes tend to range from as low as maybe $100,000 to upwards of $500,000 or more. And it's based on the size of the community, the level of sophistication. So the only answer I can give you is yes, it will be more, but it also depends on the ability of staff to collaborate, because I mentioned some of these rabbit holes. Our most successful projects are where we kind of act as part of an adjunct team for a year or so with the staff we're working with. And oftentimes there are things that staff members are happy to do, interested in doing, that supplement the consulting team's work, whether it's an ecologist, whether it's a transportation planner, whether it's a planner who's looking at code, so you can reduce costs. So again, you can be expansive on one hand, but you can then reduce costs by being more collaborative. Now, I understand everybody's busy, so it's hard for you to add that to your workload, but I think you have to start with what is you're trying to achieve. You have to get input from the folks who you want to hire, which again goes back to the importance or the desire of doing an RFQ as opposed to an RFP, because then you have a consulting firm that you like helping you figure out where the sweet spot is within your budget. But make no mistake about it, you are committing to spend more time and resources on the planning process than maybe the traditional straightforward process.
Thanks, David. We've probably gotten at least a dozen questions on equity issues. So I'll ask one of them and probably more as we go along. Have you included an equity framework in your plan so the decisions, policies, investments will be more equitable for the residents?
Yeah, and it always starts with drilling down to how do we define equity. So we're right back to the sustainability metrics. So if I said equity in my community, if I talk about desired future conditions, if I say equity in my community means everyone should be able to walk to a meaningful green space within 10 minutes of their home. That's a pretty easy equity metric or framework using GIS. If I talk about that it means also feeling welcome there, that's a more difficult one, right? So I can say part of equity means that every resident of my community feels invited and welcome to use the space near their home. Well, now I really need to talk more about what that means. And that probably means focus group meetings, and it means talking to more people about the experiences in their park. Does my park feel welcoming? Do the people who hang out in that park feel welcoming? Are there colors? Are there paving patterns? Are there materials that may be more welcoming to some ethnic groups than for others? Are signs in a language I can understand? So the equity framework starts, I think, with really large discussions about equity, like access and programming and opportunities, and then drills down into the subtleties, whether it's disability access, the list goes on and on. But the answer is yes, we dealt with equity frameworks, and I think it's getting to be more and more a part of people's system plans. And it begins with understanding what do we mean by the term equity, what do desired future conditions look like, what would those indicators of success or metrics look like, and that then allows us to go do research and collect data, both through the existing conditions analysis, but also through the needs assessment, where we get smarter about what the community cares about in terms of equity.
Thanks, David. Here's one from Stephanie Lovely, who says, the Atlanta Beltline has been criticized for its contribution to gentrification and displacement.
Yes.
Parks, how do you plan with sustainable housing and affordable cost of living goals as part of your process?
So here's another bias, so forgive me. And by the way, if anybody's got a follow-up, they're welcome to email me, or if they want to debate or discuss this. So in several communities, Atlanta and Arlington, Virginia, we've had this discussion about the conflict between affordable housing and open space. And actually, Atlanta hosts a conference every year where there was a speaker that I listened to who was encouraging people not to build nice parks in lower income areas because of gentrification. So the concept was green enough is okay. And I had a real aversion to that idea, because it was sort of saying that we don't want to build high quality facilities in underserved areas because we're going to increase property values, which are going to result in gentrification. So I believe that early in the planning process, if gentrification is a concern, then you have to start including the dimension of housing. You have to acknowledge the fact that as I improve a community, I'm going to attract more people. And the toolkit in affordable housing is different than the toolkit in oftentimes building public realm. And so you start needing to have, so instead of accepting the fact that's a trade-off between the two, which is what I reject, that it's got to be in addition to improving the community or the neighborhood, I also wish to make sure that we have affordable housing. So now I have two desired future conditions, and I have to develop metrics for both, and I have to start looking at the policies and framework for both of those, as opposed to accepting the fact right off the bat that they are contrary to one another. Because I may be able to develop affordable housing that has great open space inside it. I may come up with innovative public-private partnerships. I may be able to really do a great job of meeting the needs of the community while also having affordable housing. So again, I'm back to, I believe you have to break it down into the desired future conditions and the metrics, and go from there. So just like you have an equity framework, I think you would have a sustainable housing framework, or an affordable housing framework.
Great, thanks, David. Next question is from another one of our colleagues, Jason Dubow, They're saying 2 items in Maryland that we've asked counties to consider in their parks and recreation plans are A, opportunities to redevelop local brownfields for parks and recreation space, and B, consider preservation of uplands where coastal wetlands are expected to migrate as sea level rises. For the new process that you've described, where would these types of steps fit in?
I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record, but it's not very dissimilar to the previous discussion. So I've got redevelopment of brownfield sites. That in itself is a rabbit hole, right? There's all kinds of research that needs to go into, environmental issues, permitting issues, hazardous materials, et cetera, soil remediation, all the things you have to look at. And then coastal preservation for sea level rise is, so you identified 2 great topics right there, right? And so we're talking about how would we address those through an open space plan. It's back to the beginning that we would identify those as part of the public realm. I'm assuming these are publicly owned sites, and we would have to evaluate what does that mean to us? How's that going to influence the planning process? Who do we need to have on the team to address those? Should it be part of the open space, the system planning process? What are the desired future conditions we hope to achieve? Ideally, the project wouldn't just be about those isolated sites, right? We're talking within the context of a system planning process. So you would be looking at those sites in conjunction with all the connections that you have to the overall community. And so I think on that basis, you would, once you've established those as dimensions that you wish to explore in the planning process, then everything we talked about in the new approach applies to those as well. And so I hope I'm not being totally redundant, but that's what occurs to me in answer to your question. Again, feel free to do a follow-up if that wasn't satisfactory to you.
Okay, thanks, David. We got a few questions asking about that National Park Service guide that you mentioned. So
I need to go find it.
Yes. And we'll
Yeah,
have
what it was for those, so it's called something like the it's like the National Park Service Interagency Visitor Guide or something like that. And I'll find it, and I could send it to you all if you wish, Michael and or John, and however you wish to do it. But
sure. Well, what we can do is we can post the link if it's available online at the webinar archives page.
Yeah.
So thanks for that part. Okay. Next question here is how do you follow up after the project has been built? Have you found that you've succeeded in your assessments?
That's interesting. Sometimes we're involved and sometimes we're not. So, as anyone on the call who's on the private side will tell you, we really love staying involved. There's no one who wants to just do a one and done and be gone. So I have a great, can you read me the question again? So I started to go off on a tangent. I want to make sure I answer the question. Can you read me that question again?
Sure. It's how do you follow up after the project has been built?
Okay. So I've got a couple of projects. If you're fortunate enough to be involved in the design phase, so I mentioned like the Path 400 trail, then some agencies will do a post-design evaluation, right, to just see if that design actually met the needs as intended to. And similarly, you can do that with a system, right? You can do a post-planning evaluation to see if it met your goals. What's more fulfilling to me is just to stay continually involved. I have one client who's the city of Port St. Lucie in Central Florida, where they have adopted the high performance public spaces concept as a way to organize and transcend the silos between departments. Now, I was on a call today, and so I'm sort of their high performance public space advisor. And so we have transportation planning, engineering, stormwater, parks, redevelopment planning, all the department heads engage in a call every 2 weeks to review the capital improvement projects that are going on in the city, to make sure that they're collaborating to address all the different issues that we've talked about trying to address through high performance public spaces. So I will tell you that it's much more fulfilling to just kind of stay involved and be involved in every project, so that you can keep, oftentimes the planner of a park system plan is somewhat of a vision keeper. And when the projects get implemented, if they're no longer in the picture, there's no one to remind everybody of the big ideas that we were trying to implement when we were doing the large scale planning, and to remind the designers that, remember, we were trying to improve stormwater quality, or remember, we were trying to improve social equity. So, the continued involvement is the preferred way to go, and it's a lot of fun for the planners who are lucky enough to stay involved in the project for years and years.
Great, thanks, David. We'll just ask a couple more before we wrap up. And the next question here is from Rick Kenya, who's asking, are you finding water trail planning to be typically addressed in park and open space plans? I find it severely lacking so far, including addressing access points needed, along with improvements to allow for safe and convenient, as well as accessible, universal design for canoeing and kayaking.
Yep. So I'm an avid paddler. Remember, I live in Florida. Kayaking and paddleboarding is definitely a statewide pastime. So next to biking and walking trails, canoe, kayak, paddle access has become a top priority in almost every community that we work in. So it has become a key part of our practice. It's not identifying the trails as much, because in any community we go into, all I have to do is contact the nearest outfitter, and they've already identified the corridors that are the most popular, but it is providing the services, the shuttle services, the ramps, the launches. What's kind of interesting to me, because of smartphones, there are a lot of outfitters who have gone to being virtual, so I can go to a kayak launch and arrange for somebody to drop off a boat. I don't have to go to an outfitter. I can arrange a shuttle with someone who has a truck and a trailer. But it has become a more important part of our practice, especially the support facilities, the trailheads, the access points, and some way of figuring out shuttling and identifying opportunities for either the public agency or at least an outfitter on weekends. So yeah, it's a great question.
Thanks, David. So I think this will be our last question before we wrap. Dr. Barth, do you have some thoughts about how to make processes more permeable to each other? I struggle a lot with translating between, for example, comprehensive transportation and comprehensive parks plans. How can we begin to help these plans and processes interact better with each other? And this particular questioner works for a DOT.
I have to thank you all. These have been really thoughtful questions. Thank you very much. I couldn't have written these questions. When I was in doing my doctoral work, I actually wrote a paper comparing the Parks and Recreation System planning process to the long-range transportation planning process, because I was trying to figure out the question you just asked. And that's when I was evaluating system plans around the country. I was trying, and for me, the holy grail was finding somebody who concurrently developed long-range transportation plans and park system plans. What I found was, in the best of both, they both reflect, or I'm trying to come up with the right word. They refer to each other. So in good transportation plans, they refer to trails and open space. Good trails plans refer to complete streets and roadways. But because they come from different funding sources, and because they have different mandates, I found that at the end of the day, they kind of retreated back into, for lack of a better word, their own corner. The park system plans kind of retreat back into park speak, and the transportation plans sort of retreat back into transportation speak in their implementation plans. And so kind of failed to really integrate the two. So the recommendations I had was, first of all, could they at least be timed concurrently? So they're both in cycles. Is there any reason why in local governments we couldn't start timing that our transportation plans, our stormwater plans, our park system plans, and our future land use plans are all going to be reevaluated at the same time, let's say every 5 years or every 7 years, whatever it is. And they will begin in January and they will end in December. That would be a market improvement right there, just concurrent planning. The second part is, could the teams involved in the planning and initiation of those processes and the needs assessments, could they be cross-disciplinary? So could the planning department, the parks department, and the transportation department all participate in each other's planning process, the initiation process, the pre-planning process, and the needs assessment process? And that gets back to why Port St. Lucie is doing this high-performance public space planning team for that reason. And then even if they then break away, and I'm going to use my hands, if they come together at the beginning and then they break away for a while and do their thing and then come back together at the point they've identified their long-range visions, could they then meet again and talk about where there are opportunities to generate multiple benefits from each of their high priority improvement projects? So if you go back to the Path 400, let's say that the Transportation Department had identified the need for roadway improvements along 400 at the same time where the Parks and Rec Department had identified the need for trails. You know, someone in that meeting may say, you know what, I think there's funding available if we actually could co-locate this trail along the highway right-of-way. So I think my recommendations would be bringing a multidisciplinary team together at the same time at the beginning of these projects and at the towards the end of the projects to make sure that they are interdisciplinary and that we generate as many benefits as possible. The mantra that I've always heard in our practice was generating multiple benefits from really a single project, or multiple benefits from a single taxpayer dollar. So that's kind of the overall concept. So that's a great question to wrap up on, and thank you very much for that.
Thanks, David. We did share the link for the National Park Service, which is visitorusemanagement.nps.gov, for those who are interested in that. So David, we've covered a lot of ground today. We said go on further, but I'm just curious as to what kind of closing thoughts you'd like us to leave with and take away in our daily work now that we've heard this.
I think I'll go back to my wrap up, that if you're willing to go down this path, I think there's great benefits for everyone on the call, both individually as well as your department, your agency, as well as your community. So, if you're not really able or ready to go, full comprehensive, then pick a couple of different dimensions that maybe are a bit outside of what you would normally do. You could select, I'd like to make improvements in community health, or I'd like to make benefits in solving the food desert issue. It doesn't have to be huge steps. It could be really small steps. But I think what I found, it really enriches the process. And again, focusing on the things that your elected officials care most about. I think a lot of us in the design field have a blind spot in that we know what we really care about. We know what excites us, but we don't maybe ask enough at the beginning of a project, what is it that my electeds really care most about? And how do I make sure that what I'm addressing both addresses the needs of the community as well as the needs of the elected officials? What are the things that they worry about at night? So, again, if people have any follow-up questions, things they'd like to know about, let me know. But I really like to close by thanking everybody for staying with us and for these excellent questions. I've really enjoyed it. So, and thank you for you all for coordinating this as well.
Thanks, David. We also understand that there is an Island Press discount code that you may want to share for those who are interested in getting your book.
I'm sorry, you're asking, yes. And they make great stocking stuffers, if anybody wants to do early Christmas present shopping. So, but no, thank you for saying that.
It's the code is SMART for those who are interested in that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, well, with that, we'll conclude our webinar today with David Barth, a new approach to parks and recreation system planning. I'd like to offer a great big thank you to David for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make all this happen behind the scenes. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org, Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. So please look for this follow-up email. When you exit from the webinar today, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including another one we're doing next Wednesday, Main Street's Comeback and How It Can Come Back Again with Mary Means, one of the pioneers of America's Main Street movement, which will be at 1 o'clock Eastern. We look forward to seeing you then. Have a great day.